honored to have been invited to this conference to speak about creativity. It's quite the subject, quite a large and broad subject, so I'm going to try and do my best. Before I get into that, let me just give you a brief intro to what I do. So I'm a painter, and as far back as I can remember, I've been always drawing. My formal training took me through university studying illustration, and I rounded it off with classical training in Florence, where I learned the fundamentals of drawing and painting techniques. This gave me the tools that I needed to take on all sorts of material, rather than just being focused on one niche subject, from still life to landscape, portrait, and figurative compositions. And in every project, there is a dose of creativity, but also a heavy dose of grit and just getting it done. Beyond these more conventional applications of painting, I've also ventured out into expedition painting, which has taken me to the Arctic, the Antarctic, and up to 4,000 meters in the Alps, taking my paints with me. So what is creativity? What is it all about, being creative? So is it doing things differently, thinking outside of the box, making something extraordinary out of something ordinary, or making use of information at your disposal and using it in a new way? In my field of work, it often involves observing what already exists and adapting it to a new task, overcoming an obstacle without direct assistance, but through ingenuity and inventiveness. So let me just say from the get-go, I'm no expert in creativity. I don't know where it comes from. There's plenty of experts out there who have written books on the subject. So I'll leave it up to them to define it in their own terms. But I will agree with John Cleese's description of it, that it requires an open mind for playfulness in the planning stages, followed by a closed mind for the execution of it. This is what I referred to earlier, whether my projects have a dose of creativity, but also a dose of grit to just get things done. To paraphrase John Cleese's analogy on creativity, he says, if your project is to jump over the Grand Canyon on a motorbike, the moment you're speeding up the launching ramp is not the best time to reevaluate your plans. All I can tell you is how I get my ideas, how I nurture my creativity. I can share with you my thought process, how I navigate my craft, and how I develop my imagination. And how sometimes I see creativity just as another term for problem solving. So I'm going to go, so how am I going to do this? I'm going to share with you the process of 3 specific projects that all have their own creative examples. I have to point out that in my work, though, I do not work from photographs. Why I'm telling you this is because it might help you to better understand how I commit to my subject matter. It means that I need to seek out my subject in the real world, like many of my predecessors. I need to research where to go and how to get there efficiently. I need to endure physical challenges to get what I need. I work from life because it gives me so much more to work from, informs me on so many other levels than just visually. And that contributes to creating art that is as full of life as I can fill it with. But I find it interesting how people talk about creativity in casual conversations. For me, this happens at dinner parties or at the pub. Often the only painter in the group, I get the usual questions. Is it difficult to get inspired? How long have you been drawing for? Do you only work when you're inspired? Are you born with talent, or can you be trained? And my favorite is usually, is this your real job? The myth of the genius artist whose creativity is unattainable is something I aim to dismantle on a regular basis, to the confusion of some. I was drawing as much as any of you were when we were all 3 years old. I also played with Lego. I also ran around, climbed trees, played in the earth. I just chose to carry on with drawing. And basically, I never stopped and never had anyone to tell me to stop. Obviously, this put me at a certain advantage later on because I basically had years of practice on anyone else I met. And so it appeared that I had some natural talent. That's not so. What is talent if not a dose of practice? Same thing with creativity. It serves no one to believe that it is unattainable or requires the gods to bless you or for your stars to be aligned at birth to be creative. This sort of mythological thinking is a great disservice to the field of creativity and scares people away from even trying it sometimes. So many people think that creativity belongs to the people who can make a picture or make a sculpture, write a play, or play music. But creativity is not just about making art. It's about making use of what has come before you and applying it in a new way. It's especially accessible to people who work across different disciplines or areas of interest. And how do you get multiple areas of interest? By being curious, by being inquisitive, by being ready to be enchanted by the unfamiliar instead of fearing it or feeling unfamiliar with it. Become comfortable with the unfamiliar and nurture a curiosity for its own sake, not just in a way that you think will maximize return immediately, because you never know what will reap rewards later. So you just need to be open and willing to be inquisitive and have a go. Follow what you love and be willing to follow tangents. Tangents will often be the most rewarding, as they will always surprise you. The predictable tangents are the ones that will open up new territories you never even considered. All this creates connections in the brain. If your memory is working in your favor, you'll be able to go and pick and assemble and craft all these seemingly disconnected ideas into a tool you can use in the present for a specific task. Now, to bypass any memory problems I may have, I take notes. My notes take the form of drawings, and I have dozens of sketchbooks with drawings ranging from memories, imagined scenes, but a lot of observed phenomenon as well. So here, musicians playing music, horses moving around, natural elements and patterns in animals, architecture, ballet dancers taking a break, anything that I find interesting. And before phones were here to take photographs of everything and anything, I was basically doing that already in my sketchbooks. And all that can lead to ideas, connections, and nurture creativity. And that's what happened in this project. I'm going to share with you this first project. It's a life-size painting, which means the whole canvas is roughly, the height of it is about 3 meters 80. It's about 12 feet tall. And I'm going to go through a rough outline of basically how I came to creating something like this. I was fascinated by the phenomenon of the hero figure in mythology and the transformation stages in that narrative. That idea of being a hero gets thrown around a lot today in different ways. You only have to watch the news a bit and you'll find examples at some point of a likely or unlikely hero having saved the day. I started hearing also the idea that you'll only know if you can save someone in a disaster situation once you find yourself in that situation. No one really knows before it happens how our psyche or our bodies can switch into a hero mode or not. So these aspects of our instincts fascinated me. And especially the idea that they are unknown to us until the moment arrives. But I thought they must exist within us in some sort of balanced way. And so it all started, this whole project really started with the symbol of balance, the yin and the yang. The black and white representing opposites balanced out with a little of each within the other. This was basically the foundation of the idea, and everything else had to fit into it to help develop the project. So, where does our inner self reveal itself? I was curious if nature could give me some clues in the animal kingdom. So in the animal kingdom, the exterior aspect of an animal is a very good indicator of inner health. I started searching across different species to work out what symbolism I could pick to try and find a way of communicating this idea of the inner self. Essential for birds, their feathers are essential for birds being the tools of flight and precision hunting. A clean coat of hair on any animal reveals the inner health as it reveals how much it can spend time cleaning itself. I also randomly went on a tangent learning that in horse breeding, white patches were a sign of weakness. Whether this idea persists today, I don't know, but I found it to be an interesting reference that I intertwined into the whole project. White feather was a symbol of cowardice for soldiers deserting wars. However, in certain aspects within the same culture, white is a symbol of purity and holiness. So, how was I going to create a character with something representing the inner self? Feathers became, therefore, my symbol. The inner psyche of my protagonist was going to be revealed to the viewer through the use of feathers. And obviously, when you say feathers, that means angels start coming on board, and all the symbolism attached to angels. And they can be known for both bringers of doom and bringers of hope. Those wings are going to have one feather that's different to all the rest. Now you can remember the yin and yang symbol. That is directly inspired from that aspect. One single white feather amongst several black ones. Now, are all the feathers turning black? The transformation idea as well. Are all the feathers turning black and the white feathers are the last one to go? Or is the white feather the initiator and the rest of the feathers are going to become more white? And whose is this white feather on the steps? A previous passenger or a previous nomadic character, previous hero. The steps represent the pathway of life, here going through a narrow canyon, which helps focus all the attention on the character. The steps were studied from life in a medieval citadel in south of France. The cliffs from the Verdon Canyon, both also from the south of France. And the feathers were from a bird specimen I built at a taxidermist. And obviously the most important is the model. She posed for me for several weeks to ensure I got the most lifelike sensation of her presence through the anatomy, through the colors, through the structure. And so creativity in this project was all about joining up seemingly disconnected elements into one and finding a way to putting them all together. Letting my curiosity fill the storage space in my brain with interesting details. Here, creativity is about the combination of ideas, references, connections, and random interests that all combine together to bring about a unique composition. And then this allows the viewer to be creative as they try to decipher the story through the symbolism of all these elements. Now, in another project, my second one I'm going to go through, it was all about adapting to a new situation and finding creative solutions. Through my exposure to expedition painting, I've met exceptional individuals who chase nature around the world to interact and photograph them in their natural habitats. Sometimes this habitat is underwater. And I was presented with the opportunity to swim with sea lions off the west coast of Mexico. I'm not a photographer. My skill set is drawing and painting. So I had a lot of questions for myself. How was I going to make use of my tools in this different environment? How would I draw animals that basically seemed to never stop? How was I going to draw underwater? What was I going to use? Paper? Clearly that was not going to work. Cardboard, charcoal, pencil. None of these elements that I'm used to were really going to be working in this space. But I remembered once I saw in a museum drawings done at an excavation site by underwater archaeologists. How were they doing it? I looked into it, saw pictures of them using a slate of some kind and drawing with a pencil. After a lot of looking around in diving shops and online, I found nothing that was really going to suit me. Everything was either too small or specifically designed just to take notes. So what about plexiglass and wax pencils? Wax can't dissolve in water, so wax pastels would be perfect. However, I would have to also prepare the plexiglass so that it actually had a bite to it. The initial plexiglass I had was too slippery and I wasn't actually able to draw on them. But the thing is, once I did draw on them, it's impossible to rub out the mistakes. My drawings had to be direct and immediate. And to make sure I missed nothing, and a useful tool to actually keep all my boards together while I was floating around in the water, I clamped on a GoPro. So I could actually record as much fun footage as I could while I was drawing. Day after day in the water, drawing repeatedly the gestures, the movements that I found interesting, I was exposing myself to the exercise of capturing fleeting moments. And I improved my selection process, and my decision making through that whole process. I got better every day, and a picture was coming to mind of how all this would come together and how to orchestrate all these experiences into one single image. That was my main challenge ultimately. My GoPro footage came into use for the sardines that the sea lions and cormorants would chase every day. And so back at the studio, to fill in some of those gaps, I would draw from actual moving images, as this was much more valuable than a single image. As I'm drawing movement, I had to also continue drawing from movement, not a still image. I had no idea where I was going with this, but one stage led to another, and before I knew it, I was fully immersed in the process. And I didn't really care if I failed. I felt that this was a valuable territory I was embarking on in my own development. I did all this while I was teaching a workshop at an art school, and I shared every moment with the students over the 2 weeks I was there, even though I didn't know if this was going to lead anywhere. But I kept my trusted process from other projects, sketches, composition trials, preparatory color studies, large preparatory drawing, and eventually I felt I was in control of something that I started as a complete experiment before I tackled the final painting. The final painting is an expression of an accumulation of different moments throughout 5 days, with that single image not actually having happened at any single point. But by taking all these different moments in time and putting it together, I could offer something that a camera could not offer. I could offer the idealized sort of experience, or the visual experience of that whole time I had underwater. So I trusted the process and myself, but I didn't give myself the burden of expectation. For me, being creative is allowing yourself to play in the unknown and not to drown, pun intended, sorry, not to drown in under the threat of failure. Both at the beginning of it, where I had to make my own materials, throw myself in the water and teach myself how to draw in this environment, all the way to the studio space and trying to piece all the bits of the puzzle together. Throughout the whole thing, I considered that if it failed, I didn't care. I knew that however far I would get, I'd be learning stuff right up until I would fail. For me, any of that was going to be valuable. So this creative process was all about adapting and trying things out. Now, for my third project I'd like to share, this is all about adapting to high altitude painting. So when COVID hit and put an end to all my expedition travels, I had to turn to my home turf, the local mountains of the Alps. Landscape painting is a large part of my output, and I'm always looking for ways to improve. And the best way I found to improve is to practice copying the greats of the past, to get an understanding of how they did it. Then I realized an even better way of learning from them was to go and meet them in person. But unfortunately, all my favorite painters are dead. So the next best thing was to go stand where they stood for my favorite paintings that they did. But how was I going to do this? Randomly drive around, looking out the window, trying to see if I could recognize a scene? This didn't really seem like the most efficient tactic. Was I to ask local tourist boards to point me in the right direction? I tried, but I got so much contradictory advice that it ended up being a bit of a waste of time. Instead, I put on my own detective hat and did it myself. First, I had to find anything in my favorite painting that could lead me to find where it was painted. So we start with the title. The title could help, or the research notes around the painting. That would often give me the name of a village, or a valley, or a mountain peak. Then I would look for these names on a map. I didn't want to waste too much time on site looking around, so I figured I could use Google Earth to help locate the places even better. And this could actually allow me to float about the landscape at all sorts of elevations and slip into positions where I could align certain peaks with others and get very close to the real spot. Once this was in place, from the comfort of my own studio, I was confident that once I arrived on site and my feet were on the ground, I would just need a bit more walking about to find the actual spots. The on-site searching was still physical, but at least I knew I was not on the completely wrong side of the mountain. And it all paid off. In this other example, I found the spot using the same tricks, and I could finally start learning from my heroes. Some spots were easier than others. Most painters stay at the bottom end of the valleys, but other painters were actual mountaineers. And I was going to need to get my gear organized and my fitness level up to start following in these guys' footsteps. So my immersion into their world is really essential to understand how they painted. It's one thing to copy out of a book. It's all another to try the same painting in the same conditions outdoors after several hours of hiking or climbing. Some places I couldn't take my painting gear, but I would insist on having my sketchbook with me. That's the sketchbook in the middle, that little black hardback book there in the middle with just one single pencil. And so to start with, I chose to climb the Dent du Géant, which is this spike in the middle of these peaks, which is just over 4,000 meters, about 13,000 feet. With a guide, we made it up in the morning, leaving at 4 a.m. and arriving on top at about 10 a.m. I just had a few minutes to rest before I had to start drawing. I sat for about 20 minutes or so to start sketching the surrounding peaks. The peak was small, and soon we had to make space for other groups of climbers arriving. Now, the added pressure of drawing within a time frame really develops your focus incredibly well. It was a very different drawing experience from what I usually have. I felt my lines were more confident, they were more accurate. I felt one with the landscape. Or, alternatively, maybe the altitude was simply making me delusional. I'm not sure. But the experience itself was so valuable, seeing how much goes into making a drawing or a painting from these places. And in the days of my heroes, their gear was heavier, and they had a much tougher time, I think, than I did. And I realized that in some cases, these sort of outings can almost be 90% hiking and just 10% painting. So I was fascinated by this whole process, and I found myself spurred on by the challenge of trying to match these incredible painters. And I started looking into more, and then something else started happening. I realized that all these places that had been painted 100, 200, even 300 years ago had changed. And a lot of spots were difficult to match today, even though I was exactly in the right places. Not only had the glaciers disappeared, but even the trees had started blocking much of the views that I was searching out for. From my example previously, you can see in this one how thick the canopy of trees is in the foreground in front of these mountains in just over 100 years. So I realized that changing natural environments have been documented through photography on a global scale with time lapses, comparative photographs, but this has only been happening for about 150 years. But through my art books, I was seeing artists documenting these changes much further back in time, as far back as 4 centuries. So I started thinking, what if landscape painters could be our record keepers to testify about how our world has been changing? And further than that, what if a message of conservation, what if the general message of conservation today was so saturated with data and photography or film that people were turning away from the subject? What if art could offer a fresh perspective and offer an alternative sort of back door to re-engage into the conversation of natural preservation and climate change? And so my project evolved, and it's still in process today. A film crew believed in my project enough to actually follow me up there. And currently we're at the hurdle of searching for the financing to allow the project to fully grow into a documentary. Now, creativity is also about how to adapt and allow change to happen. Projects can start one way and then change, and we have to adapt with it. My adaptability as a painter had to happen to simply manage the physical demands of being in such places. I could have stayed at the easy viewpoints or stayed at the studio copying from a book, but I had the urge to experience it for the benefit of enriching the result. Rather than do what was comfortable, I chose to do the uncomfortable, perhaps sometimes putting myself at unnecessary risk, but it never really felt like it. To me, all of it felt necessary. My curiosity simply pushed me to inquire into whether these extra steps would be of any benefit. And in hindsight, they absolutely are a benefit. Again, without expecting to come back every time with a masterpiece, I simply had to see how much I could do and to understand myself better in the process. I was at play, trying new things, exploring the process of attempting things without expecting a result. For me, that is the source of my creativity. The ability to attempt things without expecting an immediate reward. What started as looking to improve my painting took on a completely new dimension. The collection of experiences led me from one idea to another, and by being open to play, this allowed me to break through into connecting dots that I didn't know even existed. My advice to anyone is that creativity is not one single thing. Like so much in life, it is a combination of things. To cultivate your senses, develop your curiosity, feel comfortable with failing, relish what you gain through any experience, enjoy the process and not just the result, so you can feed your creativity and let it grow. Thank you again for having me, and thank you for listening.
Fantastic, Toby. That is amazing. Just to see that contrast, see the contrast in what you've captured versus those that have walked or hiked before you. So amazing. Now we can open up the. We've got plenty of time on our side, so we can open up the floor to any of the participants that have any queries, questions, or reactions. Oh yeah, go for it, Ruth.
This was an amazing talk. Thank you. And it makes me think of a creative problem-solving method called ID art. And this was something that was developed by someone, I believe it was in South America. And it's actually looking at different paintings and then helping to solve a problem that you have. So it's based on something called lateral thinking, which is breaking your thinking patterns. And you look at this piece of art to what how it speaks to you and what it's telling you. And then you can then relate whatever experience you were having or insights you were having from that picture to your problem. And what you were speaking of said to me, I've only ever seen it done with one picture. What would happen if you did it with during a workshop with 3 or 4, maybe 5 pictures? And so it really spoke to me. Thank you for your insights.
Fascinating. Thanks. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the lateral thinking thing is something that has to happen all the time when you're trying to be creative about things, because going along things in a linear aspect, one part tends to hide the next. But as soon as you start thinking across without being in a linear aspect, I mean, I just do it naturally, probably just from training and just exposing myself to project after project. How to deliberately do that, I suppose, is just to expose yourself to it and confront problems, trying to solve them, and getting good with practice, I guess.
I can ask another question.
Yep.
First of all, thank you so much, Toby. I mean, this is exactly what the conference is all about. Using your personal stories and your experience to, unpack the whole creative process. So absolutely nailed it.
Great.
My question is, when you're painting these landscapes, how much of a responsibility do you feel to capture it as accurately and detailed as possible, because you're straying into the records, like and it's not a photograph, so it can't be perfectly identical to what you see in front of you, but and also when you're looking at the paintings from 200 years ago, how much do you think those painters were feeling a sense of accurately portraying what they actually saw versus maybe adding a few extra little things to make it look good as a painting?
Well, that was definitely part of the selection process when I was looking at painters. So I would focus on painters who, from their body of work, I could tell were accurate, faithful to nature, not adding random things, unicorns or rainbows in all sorts of weird places. So I had to whittle it down, and there are plenty of landscape painters who would make up a foreground just for the sellability of an image. Have to put a little cottage here because otherwise it won't sell. The painters I had to select, I had to whittle out those kind of people. Turner was maybe a bit of a tricky one, because I know he sort of dabbled in a little bit of both. He would be very faithful to nature, and then occasionally he would also add a few elements in the foreground to give often a sense of scale. There'd be a little farmer and some goats in the foreground. But in the most part, Turner was pretty faithful to what he's doing. But in the group of painters I selected, he was probably the one who was the most free with interpretation. But having said that, within that time frame when artists were working, the freedom to be frivolous and add things was a much smaller scope than what you can imagine people doing today. With the advent of modern art and so on, that's sort of blown up to a much wider spectrum of adding in all sorts of interesting things. So the painter selection was pretty important, so that I wasn't, also I didn't want to select a painting that it was impossible to find. Sort of, oh, that mountain's just been taken from a different country and added there, and I'm just running around the mountains pointlessly trying to find this scene. And then when I'm painting them, I'm trying to be as faithful as possible to the view. And in painting, I can't get the detail that is in photography, but I like to remind people that often talk about the comparison between painting and photography, that regardless what picture you're making, the details are not what make a picture. It's usually the bigger structure, the impactful elements of the painting. The details are usually fun to look at, and because they're fun to look at, people think that the structural foundation of a painting is in the details, but in fact that's just really the superficial stuff. What really holds you and captivates your attention in an image is the large placement of the compositional elements. So as far as the responsibility I feel of being accurate, I don't feel too nervous about the lack of detail with a painting, because ultimately it's the largest impression that's really important.
Got it. And it's interesting how the painters 200 years ago just wouldn't have necessarily had on their radar to even think about adding in other elements necessarily, because that I mean the Turner, like I said, was probably the only one who would add a little bridge here, a little tree there, or a little farmer. And usually it would limit itself to that. I haven't come across people trying to make a realistic painting and having Zermatt's Matterhorn right next to the Mont Blanc, and then dragging some other mountain from putting Everest next to it or something. Nothing got quite that surreal. So so it was lucky that way. The only ones that were maybe a little less accurate in the drawing and didn't really convey the structure or the weight of ice or the rocks and so on. Sometimes a little chocolate box here, as we like to call them,
sort of slightly more naive or cliche sort of painters, whittle those out a little bit, because they were in fact usually just looking to make a pretty picture rather than this real connection, almost like doing a portrait of a rock or of a mountain, which I found was a much more involved process, and it really came out in those pictures.
Got it. All right, over to Ruth.
Oh, I forgot to take off my hand.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Another question. That's all right. Apeshka.
Hi, Toby.
Hello.
So how are you?
Great.
So I
Thanks
really enjoyed.
Thanks for getting through it.
No, not at all. I really enjoyed your entire talk. And if it's okay, I'm just going to share a little bit about what I liked about each section that you
Of course,
did.
yeah, great.
So
Yeah.
I think the first one, I really loved how you use location, sort of zone in and finally compose your entire painting. And frankly, I don't think I had paid attention to some of the details, maybe because the picture on the left was showing you in side profile working on it. So I hadn't noticed the white feather. I hadn't noticed the feather on the step. And I think I noticed later on that she's levitating, which I mean, flying, but I didn't realize that till I saw the zoom in. And
Yes.
I really
People
loved
usually get that, later. They look at it and all of a sudden, like, wait a minute, she's not even touching the ground. Yeah.
I really loved how you try to use the elements of location and then even, tying into animal behaviors or characteristics of animals. And I think you sort of carry that forth even with your underwater. I remember seeing picture right in the starting in the collage, and I was like, what is he using underwater to draw? So I'm glad that you looked at that. And I loved that the entire painting at the end was a composite of different movements. So it's more like, I know you mentioned a phrase, but I can't recall what you said, but it feels like you've actually managed to capture different times.
That's right. That's right.
It
was an accumulation of the experience of a whole week into one image, rather than doing several different paintings. And that's the wonderful thing about painting versus photography. I always tell people that's the advantage that painters have, is that we don't only have to rely on whatever happened. We can take all that and actually pull it into making a full immersive experience of a wide time zone.
Favorite time machine.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And finally, with your entire experiment, mountaineering and all of that, I hadn't actually thought about the fact that painters might be mountaineers themselves. And although I've looked at Turner's paintings, I think everybody associates him like probably with the Temeraire, the ship that he's painted on the sea, more than maybe other things.
Right.
But I love that you actually put yourself out there. And interestingly, I think a few weeks ago, I had actually seen someone make an Instagram reel where their grandmother was an artist. And I think this was in the US. So their grandmother had actually captured something maybe in the mountains itself. And he went back to find it. And he made this whole
cool.
reel trying to show how it has changed as well.
Right.
And I was just like, wow, that's really coincidental thing that happened. But I think at the end of all of it, what I wanted to present to you or perhaps ask you is your entire art process, at least with what you shared with us today, comes across as very interdisciplinary. And I think what I'd like to ask is, how important do you think it is for any form of art to be interdisciplinary in nature? And would you be working towards something new? Like, is there a new, would there be a new area or a subject that you'd be exploring if you've thought about it at all?
I think one part, so I think some of the greatest art I've ever come across is from artists who do have a broad set of interests. You just go back and look at Da Vinci. It's difficult to find a subject that he didn't want to take on. He was drawing maps. He even wrote theater, opera, machines. We know all the different things that he would like to engage with. Um, I think the artists themselves need to have multidisciplinary sort of interests for being able to just enrich their work. I just happen to be maybe it's just in the nature of some people. You just get distracted by stuff. I'll retro engineer and just pretend I'm really interested in a lot of things, but I think I just get distracted by things that spike my interest, and then I go down the rabbit hole and start looking, and then that will somehow make a connection with something that I'm currently working on. Going to museums all the time, just exposing yourself to other things. It's very difficult to create anything in a vacuum, and I think you can almost correlate a direct scale on how much exposure you have to the world and how good and how communicative your artwork can be to other people. And as far as developing into other projects, so the reason why I sort of pursued expedition painting after I was exposed to an expedition in 2015 for the first time in the Arctic, is that I felt that I was trained to paint well and draw well, but the idea of thinking that I'm only going to apply that to try and make pretty paintings to sell was a bit of a depressing reductionist sort of option. So one of my early passions was natural world, natural sciences. I was drawing at the Oceanographic Museum here in Monaco, natural history museums, always trying to study the natural sciences. And for me, then it just became a no-brainer, just automatically went into sort of supporting the natural sciences by creating imagery that can help communicate ideas or attract people to the subject, draw people into the conversation. And then I discovered all these different artists from the past. The Natural History Museum in New York, for example, the diorama painters who painted these amazing backdrops behind the stuffed animals. They're some of the most underrated painters in New York. When you go to the museums, the Met, the Frick, the Brooklyn Museum, everyone forgets that you can also go to the Natural History Museum and discover these incredibly talented painters who just created these illusions. You literally think you're in those places. And that took me on to a whole other level of appreciating how art can be more than just having a picture on a wall. It can start going into science research. It can go into biology. It can go into climate change awareness projects, such as the ones I was involved with in the Arctic and the Antarctic. So I'm going to continue sort of dabbling and seeing how these things can keep my interest going as well.
We have time for just one more question from Ruth.
Or is your hand lowered?
I think so. I've just been absorbing what my interest is in problem solving and how you can connect the dots in different ways. And I've been doing workshops with people to do visioning and problem solving. And you've given me all kinds of ideas. What really went bam for me was when you said an immersive experience. So what I've been doing is maybe one or two exercises. And I thought, why not have sort of as I mentioned about being able to look at different pieces of art, but then when you said an immersive experience, I was already picking how wonderful. You talked about storytelling, the importance of location, symbolism, your senses and movement. And I thought, wow, wouldn't it be great to have a full day workshop with the same problem or the same project that you wanted ideas from, and to put people in all these different experiences with that thread that goes together with their actual problem. And I thought, thank you. This is wonderful. Yeah.